Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive. You ready to get into it?
Always ready. Let's do it.
Awesome. So today we're tackling something pretty interesting.
Hmm.
This idea that former President Trump is deeply connected to the 19th century.
Mhm.
What is that about?
Well, it's definitely an interesting lens to view his presidency through, for sure.
Yeah.
And that's exactly what we're going to be looking at today. So we're diving into an excerpt from this article, How Trump Will Fail. And it basically unpacks this whole idea that Trump seems to draw inspiration from this very particular period in American history.
Okay, so the 19th century, that's a pretty specific time period, right?
Yeah.
Are we talking top hats and horse-drawn carriages here? What's the author getting at?
Yeah, well, they point out that Trump frequently references figures and themes from the 19th century. They even say that he went so far as to quote William McKinley in his second inaugural address.
No way, McKinley, seriously.
Yeah, it's pretty wild. Of all the presidents to quote, he chooses McKinley. It's he's purposely reaching back to a very specific vision of America, you know?
Right, it's not just a coincidence. It's got to be more than just admiring a few historical figures.
Exactly. The author even quotes Trump as saying, the spirit of the frontier is written into our hearts.
Mhm.
It's he sees himself embodying this rugged individualism that we tend to associate with that era.
Oh, yeah, for sure. The whole cowboy going west, conquering the wilderness vibe.
Exactly. And that's where things start to get really interesting, because the author goes on to suggest that the 19th century holds a particular appeal for Trump because of its explosive growth, economic expansion, and this unapologetic materialism.
So are they implying that there's a parallel between the unbridled capitalism of the 19th century and Trump's approach to business and politics?
Yeah, I think that's definitely part of it. Think about it. The 19th century was all about rapid industrialization, westward expansion, the railroad boom.
Oh, yeah, the railroads.
Big
That
one.
was huge. We went from 3,000 miles of track in 1840 to almost 260,000 by 1900. It's crazy.
It is. And the author uses this historical context to kind of underscore their point. They actually quote a historian named Henry Steele Commager, who described 19th century Americans as being tolerant of things like speculation, advertising, deforestation, and the exploitation of natural resources.
Wow. Okay, I can definitely see how someone might draw a parallel to some of the criticisms of Trump's business practice and policies.
Right, and it's not just about economics. The author argues that there are deeper connections as well, particularly when it comes to national identity.
Okay, so how does national identity fit into all of this?
Well, think about it. In the 19th century, a lot of American identity was being forged out on the frontier. You had all these rough and tumble individuals carving their own path, defying the established order, rejecting the East Coast elites.
Yeah, I could see how that idea of self-reliance and distrust of authority might still resonate with a lot of people today, especially those who feel like the system isn't working for them.
Exactly. And that's what the author argues, that this anti-establishment sentiment, which was so strong in the 19th century, is mirrored in Trump's base today.
So it's this rejection of snobs
Yeah.
and the feeling of being dismissed by coastal elites.
Exactly. And it ties into this idea of the frontier spirit, this
Yeah.
sense of independence and a willingness to challenge the status quo.
Wow. So we're potentially seeing this link between the frontier spirit and the sort of populist anger
Yeah.
that fueled both 19th century expansion and arguably Trump's rise to power.
That's exactly it. And the author makes a really important distinction here. They argue that Trump's movement isn't actually an oligarchy, as some claim, but rather a form of populism that taps into that same frontier spirit.
Okay, so it's not just about the wealthy elite. It's about appealing to a broader sense of grievance and a desire for change.
Right, and that's a crucial point because it helps us understand the appeal of Trump's message to a certain segment of the population.
That's interesting. But, I'm wondering if the author might be overstating this connection between Trump and the 19th century. Just a bit. There are tons of differences between then and now.
Yeah, that's a fair point. It's important to avoid making these simplistic historical comparisons.
Right.
But what I find fascinating about this piece is how the author uses the 19th century as a framework to try and understand some of the deeper motivations and anxieties that are driving Trump's base, and how all of that connects back to his leadership style.
Okay. So it's less about a literal one-to-one comparison and more about using history to illuminate the present.
Exactly. And it's not just about nostalgia. There's a deeper critique the author is making here.
I'm intrigued. Tell me more about this critique. What are they getting at?
Well, that's where we start to see some of the potential dangers that the author is warning about when it comes to this whole 19th century throwback mentality.
Okay, now we're talking. I'm ready for the juicy stuff. Spill the tea.
All right, well, buckle up because things are about to get interesting. You see, the author's argument is that while populism can be really powerful when it comes to identifying problems, pointing out what's wrong, it often falls short when it comes to actually offering effective solutions.
Ah, so are you saying that while Trump might be good at tapping into those grievances, that sense of frustration,
Yeah.
he might not be so good at actually governing effectively, like coming up with workable solutions?
Yeah, that's basically the core of their argument.
Yeah.
And they even use the example of Trump's AI development project to kind of illustrate this point. They criticize it as being all hype, no substance.
Really?
Yeah, and at the same time, they point out that he also revoked all these safety measures for AI development. So it's like he's pushing for this rapid advancement without thinking about the potential consequences.
So it's like, let's throw a bunch of money at the shiny new tech and hope for the best. Forget about any guardrails or safety nets.
Exactly. It's about disruption without much thought for the long-term implications. And that really gets to the heart of the author's concern. They argue that while this kind of disruptive approach, shake things up, might work in the business world, it can be absolutely disastrous when you try to apply it to government.
Interesting. So are they saying that Trump's approach is actually dangerous because it weakens these essential institutions?
That's a key takeaway here for sure. The author sees Trump's brand of populism as potentially leading to a concentration of power and an erosion of those checks and balances that are so crucial to a functioning democracy. And they believe that's ultimately harmful.
Hmm. Yeah, that's a pretty sobering thought, especially when you consider how much emphasis the American system places on those checks and balances.
Right. It's a fundamental principle. And this whole line of thinking leads us to what the author sees as like the major challenge for the Democratic Party in this whole context.
Okay, so given all of this, how do they think Democrats should respond to this sort of 19th century throwback populism? Like, what's their advice?
Well, the author doesn't sugarcoat it. They argue that Democrats really need to start by acknowledging the legitimacy of some of the concerns that are driving Trump's supporters. They can't just dismiss them as, ignorant or racist or stuck in the past.
So it's not enough to just focus on Trump's rhetoric or personality. Democrats need to actually engage with the underlying issues that are fueling his popularity.
Exactly. The author is basically saying that there are real economic anxieties, cultural frustrations, and a sense of being left behind that are driving this movement. Democrats need to understand and address those concerns if they want to move forward.
I can see how that would be a tough balancing act. On one hand, you have to acknowledge the real pain that people are feeling, but on the other, you don't want to validate harmful ideologies or give a platform to extremism.
For sure. It's like walking a tightrope. But the author's point is that you can't really defeat something you don't understand. You have to be able to speak to people where they are, even if you totally disagree with their conclusions.
So let's say Democrats do acknowledge some of the problems that Trump is pointing at. Where do they go from there? How do they differentiate themselves and offer a real alternative?
The author's argument really hinges on this idea of competence. They believe that Democrats need to make the case that while Trump might be good at tapping into those grievances, he's completely ineffective at actually addressing them in a meaningful way.
So it's not enough to just critique Trump's style or his rhetoric. They need to offer a clear and compelling alternative, a better way forward.
Exactly. The author suggests that Democrats should really focus on presenting themselves as competent reformers, capable of building solutions rather than just tearing things down.
So it's about being the architects, not the demolition crew.
That's a great way to put it. The author seems to believe that Democrats need to convince voters that they can create a more just and equitable society without resorting to the kind of disruptive chaos that Trump represents.
It sounds like they're advocating for a more nuanced approach, one that recognizes the complexity of these problems and offers realistic solutions rather than just empty promises.
Right. It's about appealing to both the heart and the head, acknowledging the emotional weight of people's concerns, but also offering concrete plans and policies that can actually make a difference.
Yeah, that makes sense. But it sounds like a pretty tall order, especially in today's political climate. Now, how do you convince people that competence and thoughtful solutions are more effective than the kind of firebrand populism that Trump embodies?
Well, the author actually brings up a really interesting historical parallel here. They point to the progressive era in the early 20th century.
Oh, interesting. Tell me more about that.
So back then you had this like huge wave of populist anger directed at things like corporate greed, political corruption, social inequality, all the stuff we're still grappling with today.
That sounds familiar.
Yeah, exactly. But the interesting thing is that instead of just like tearing everything down, the progressives actually focused on like building institutions and systems to address those problems.
So they were trying to create lasting solutions,
Yeah.
not just like quick fixes.
Right. And some of those solutions are still with us today. Think about it, things like the FDA, the Federal Trade Commission, all those regulatory bodies that we kind of take for granted now.
Those are like foundational institutions.
Exactly. And they were born out of this period of intense social and political upheaval. And the author is arguing that we need that same kind of institutional thinking today. You know, we need leaders who can channel the energy of populism into concrete, sustainable solutions, not just empty rhetoric.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It makes you wonder, though, if there's even a way to bridge that gap between populism and effective governance. Like, can we tap into that energy and frustration without falling into the trap of simplistic solutions and divisive rhetoric?
That's the big question, isn't it? And the author seems to believe that it all comes down to leadership. You know, we need leaders who understand how complex these issues really are, but who can also connect with people on an emotional level. Leaders who can articulate a vision for the future that's both aspirational and achievable.
Yeah, it's easy to get caught up in the day-to-day drama of politics. But you're right. We need to think bigger picture. Think about the historical context, the deeper motivations, and the long-term consequences of our actions.
Exactly. And this whole deep dive has really been helpful for that. Just kind of highlighting the challenges, but also some potential ways forward. So if I had to leave our listeners with one key takeaway, it would be this.
Okay, what would that be?
It's easy to get swept up in the headlines and the controversies, but it's crucial to step back and consider those larger forces at play, to understand the historical context, the deeper motivations, and the potential consequences of the choices we make as a society.
That's powerful.
Yeah.
So it's not just about who we vote for. It's about being informed and engaged citizens who are actively shaping the direction of our country.
Absolutely. We all have a responsibility to do that, whether it's through voting, participating in our communities, or even just having those tough conversations with friends and family. We can all play a role in building a more informed and engaged democracy.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Well, this has been another fantastic deep dive. Thanks for joining me and sharing your insights.
Always a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
Until next time, folks, keep those brains buzzing. And remember, stay curious.